start the recording today. So the topic for today is using controlled vocabularies, and we will talk about this very generally as an introduction for the first few minutes, and then we will have two example cases from two national contexts, from France and from Spain. And I'm going to be joined for this by my colleagues Manonmani Restif and Vignaud from the Service interministériel des Archives de France. And from Spain, I will be joined by Santiago Muriel from the Subdirección General de los Archivos Estatales, and by Javier Requejo from the Archivo de la Real Chancelleria de Valladolid. As mentioned, this is part of a three-part series on controlled vocabularies. We will have two sets of this series in order to cover different time zones. So we are currently in the set covering the time zones from Europe to Oceania. And there also is a second set covering the time zones from the Americas to Europe. In each of these sets, you will have three sessions. Today's sessions, as I mentioned, is about giving an overview of controlled vocabulary use. The second session in 2 weeks' time on the 29th of March will be about encoding controlled terms in archival description. And then we will have a third session on the 12th of April, where we will have a few use cases, how you can use controlled vocabularies in practice. What I want to start us with is just a few definitions so that we know what we mean when we talk about vocabularies. And this is a image of the Tower of Babel, because vocabularies essentially are what they mean. So they are means to translate from one context into another, and they are means for us to communicate with each other. So when we talk about vocabularies, we essentially talk about lists of standardized terms or codes. Ideally, those lists are controlled. That means there's a process in place to agree on the initial list. And there also is a process in place to agree on any changes. So there's some agency behind a vocabulary that maintains the vocabulary and also maintains update to it. This agency also functions as the authorization agency for the vocabulary and makes sure that the vocabulary is available for broader use. Just to mention these terms, as they are often kind of used interchangeably with the term vocabulary. So there are different types of vocabularies, and they get more sophisticated the further down we get into this list. So you might also have heard about taxonomies. And taxonomies, compared to simple vocabularies, already have some classification behind it. They are often organized hierarchically, so you might have broader concepts, narrow concepts, you might have parent and children terms. And those terms can also have polyhierarchical relations to each other. So one term can be the subterm of more than one. There also is the term thesauri that is sometimes used, and that's kind of extending on the taxonomies by also including cross-references. So you might have relations between two terms where you have a see also relation. And thesauri also includes synonyms, antonyms, and variations of terms, often kind of related to each other with the same as relation. And you might also find explanations and some history about the terms in a thesaurus. And the last term that you might have heard in the context of vocabularies is the term ontologies. And this is kind of the most sophisticated version, so to say, of a vocabulary, which allows you to include more relationship options between terms. You can be more specific in the types of relationships that you want to set between the terms. And there also are relationships between different entities. So it might be that you're not only kind of establishing relations between the persons that your vocabulary or your ontology is talking about, but you might also be establishing relations between these persons and, for example, places. being that specific, ontologies are often also domain specific. So they are used in a specific context. They're used by a specific group of institutions. And that also allows them to be more flexible in their use cases as they need to be. A little bit of background before we go into more details about vocabularies. I want to just kind of mention how ISAG, the International Standard Archival Description, talks about access points, because in the actual elements and fields, if you know ISAG, you don't really find that as an access point. But essentially what ISAG mentions as access points is names, terms, keywords, phrases, or codes that may be used to search, identify, and locate an archival description. And they're also saying that access points are based on the elements of description. So one classic example is the creator of the archival material, which can be a person, an organization, or a family. And that might be a term that you have kind of taken from a vocabulary. And ISAG also stresses that the value of vocabularies or of these access points comes with authority control. So as soon as you've got some framework behind those terms, you can also be sure that you are more interoperable, that your data can be exchanged with data of others, and that it's also can be retrieved more easily via those access points. ISAG also then points to a second standard by the International Council on Archives, EAS-CPF, and that's a standard used for describing corporate bodies, persons, and families that may be named as creators in the archival descriptions. And essentially, EAS-CPF is seen as a set of general rules to establish archival authority records, which is also the reason why ISAG doesn't go any further into detail with this regard. In terms of this webinar and how we came about establishing this series, there is a project in the United States building a national finding aid network, which ran between September 2020 and February 2023. So they just kind of wrapped up that project. And one of the things that they looked at was specific parts of archival description that support discovery and control access points, as we have just heard in the context of ISAG in terms of retrievability, is one of those fields that supports discovery quite extensively. So what NAFAN has done is that they have taken around 145,000 archival collections from the 12 aggregators that are part of that project and have done an analysis of how the EAD tags used in their data are kind of distributed across the whole data set. So they have created what they call an EAD data dashboard, where you can look at different pieces and elements. And what they found is that there is quite a high coverage in terms of controlled access terms when we look at the level of the collection or the fonts. So 85% of the collections analyzed had some variations of access points mentioned there, mostly subjects, followed by names of persons, organizations, and places. And then there also were some types of materials, while names of families or occupations were only mentioned little, and there were nearly nothing on functions. On the lower description levels, however, on the different components, only 2% of the components analyzed in that whole data set that NAFAN looked at had control access points. So there also is kind of already is kind of a focus of where controlled access points are currently used, at least in the US context. They then did further analysis of what you can encode more specifically in this context. And they found that around 45%, or depending on the type of access point, a little bit more even, of these access terms mentioned a controlled vocabulary as their source. So they pointed to something like the Library of Congress subject headings in terms of, this is where I got this term from, this is where I got the name of this person from, this is where I got the subject term from. However, not even 10% of all those access terms pointed to the actual URI of the specific term. So there is some standardization in there by the way that people are including terms from controlled vocabularies, but there's still little going on in terms of linking that with something that can be used more interactively in an online context. I also wanted to mention, because that is something that I'm working with in the European context, Europeana publishing framework. Europeana, for anyone who doesn't know Europeana, is an aggregating service that allows access to Europe's digitized cultural heritage from any type of institution, from libraries to archives to museums to archaeological heritage sites, etc., etc. And the publishing framework defines, among other things, 3 tiers of metadata quality, aiming to improve discovery. So we are again in the point of retrieval. And Europeana has coined the phrase, the more you give, the more you get. And one thing that they have in this tier model is that they talk about enabling elements, which essentially is speaking about textual information, about subjects, places, peoples, and time spans in their context. And then they enhance that as a next step into contextual classes. And that is where those vocabulary terms are connected with URIs to actually be intuitive and usable. So in which contexts can vocabularies help? So we already have heard about kind of the retrieval aspect, but I also wanted to point out a few other things where vocabularies, and there we are again at the language aspect in terms of translating from one context to another, can be helpful. So if we see this example here from Tizian, we can see we got the name in different languages, writings, and spellings. And if we only had those literals, those texts, then it might be tricky for us to actually make the connection between the same name in Italian and the same name in, for example, Hebrew. If we, however, use a vocabulary term for this, that vocabulary term comes with an identifier, and that allows us to make a connection. Similarly, we might see use cases where vocabularies help in localization. So this is an example in German, and I apologize to anyone who doesn't speak German, but I'm sure similar cases also exist in other language. So depending on the region of Germany where you live, the term for bread roll can be quite specific and can be something completely different from what you would use in High German. And so this can also kind of be something where vocabularies could help. The next point is making connections between historical and contextual terms. So making, for example, the connection between Lutetia and nowadays Paris. Or, and this will be a focus of the third session, actually, culturally inappropriate terms. So in the third session, we'll look at use cases in the context of decolonization. And this example here is actually also pointing to that context where in the original description, which was created in the early 19th century, terminology was used that you would usually not use anymore nowadays. And there also might be domain and content specific terms where a vocabulary can help and a vocabulary can clarify. So this is an example, a snapshot from the website of the Archives of the Federal Commissioner for the Records of the State Security Service of the former Democratic Republic. And you can see there are quite a few terms that are very specific to that context, and so someone who hasn't got the background might not necessarily know to use appropriately. How can vocabularies be used? We already talked about retrieval. Here's an example of topics, so subject mappings done in Archives Portal Europe. Disambiguation, so if we have the same person or different persons with the same name, or even in this case, a creator on another planet with the same name as an artist, then using vocabularies can help us disambiguate. And we can also build relations once we have vocabularies in there. I already mentioned that at the definition stage, when we talked about the different types and different specificities of relations that you can build with vocabularies. And as a last point, I just wanted to give some examples of vocabularies that can be used. And this will also lead us to the next two presentations. So you can have organizational vocabularies or national vocabularies or international ones. And essentially, the broader the use of the vocabulary that you implement, the easier connections can be made with materials from other institutions and other domains. And the more specific the use of your vocabulary is, the more specific terms can be applied if required by and used for the material being described. So there is kind of this variation which you essentially have to decide for your own use case, which type of vocabulary serves you best. And of course, you also will have to decide which type of access terms you might want to describe, because there are different vocabularies available for different types of terms. And I'm going to stop here with my sharing, and I'm going to give the floor to Manonmani and to Louis first, who will be talking about some examples from the French context.
So, thank you, Kerstin, and good morning, afternoon, evening to all according to your locations. We very heartily thank the organizers to give us the opportunity to present the evolution of today's indexing practices in French archives. To begin with, we would like to introduce you first to the network of French public archives, which goes back to the French Revolution. The Service interministériel des Archives de France et Office of the Ministry of Culture overviews all activities of French public archives. For example, in the area of description, SIAF establishes the rules for description and indexing, represents French archives in national and international normalization work groups, and manages the national aggregator portal France Archives. In the network of public archives, the national archives created in 1791 are responsible for the state and national level archives. They have produced since the 19th century about 30,000 finding aids. Some of them are really historical textbooks, and National Archives are also trailblazers in France for computerization of archives since the 1970s. However, in this talk, we refer only to the central entities based in Paris and not to the two branches for industrial and colonial archives. The other main archival institutions are the 97 Archives départementales created in 1796 for local government archives, one in each department, which is the main territorial subdivision in France. Due to local tradition and resources, description practices are diverse. So we choose the example of the Archives départementales of Flandre, which is a medium-sized institution in the south of France with 14 kilometers of archives, a team of 28 people, more than 1,000 finding aids, computerized management since 2000, and a website launched in 2006. The other archives, EAD is also used in other public and university libraries who have archives, but this network have their own guidelines and use vocabularies from the National Library of France or the University Libraries Network. And their practices could have been the object of another talk. Our presentation today will focus on indexing and use of controlled vocabularies within the XML files in 4 parts: a tradition going back to paper indexing, the renewal of practices with the presentation of 2 use cases of national and local archives. Next one, please. So starting with the subject. As without identification, archives aren't useful, description has been regulated since the 19th century with the famous principle of provenance or respect des fonds, which was issued in 1841, and detailed classification frameworks for each level of archival institutions. Indexing, mainly persons and places, is perceived since the 19th century as a simple means to direct a reader among the numeric finding aids. But it flourished in the 1960s with a new type of finding aid, the detailed numeric inventory, which included indexes and some principles still in use today, as shown by the multiple published instructions by the SIAF. These principles are indexing based on descriptions and not on documents, which was also highlighted in IZJ, as Kerstin said before. The use of controlled vocabularies, originally local, then national from 1899 onwards, and now possibly international, is promoted.
The Satellite Center of the National Archive for Contemporary Archives opened in 1969, had to cope with a massive amount of archives. So around 1980, using software to manage such volumes appears to be an obvious solution. After 2 software modules for entries and communication, 3-and-3 service was launched for description and indexing. The program was conducted with pragmatism and efficiently adjusted gradually to the evolving situation. The free indexing of the beginnings have been organized in the vocabulary. 3-and-3 vocabularies and finding aids have been merged into the archival information system, but the original database is still available on the National Archive website.
Thank you. And in the Archive departmental, this indexing of archives became compulsory in 1979 when was created a unique series called W, and the classification networks frameworks were dropped. This new series was for post-1940 archives. To cope with the mass of archives, a structured form of description, a simple form, was defined in which indexing plays an important role. The principles issued in the 1960s were recalled, and this led to the publication of National Thesaurus for Subject in 1987. This thesaurus, called very fondly by French archivist Thesaurus W, meant only to the index local contemporary administrative archives. It was built from vocabularies used in different local archives. There were many editions and the 2009 edition extended its scope to all periods of history and made it available online. It's still broadly used today, and though adapted as much as possible to the norm on thesaurus, its structure is still much influenced by the context of traditional paper archives management. Thesaurus is largely criticized for its limited number of concepts and mainly the use of terms not compliant with the natural language. For example, instead of saying prison, you have to say choose penitentiary equipment. However, the situation is slowly changing in France, and we are going towards a national practice. France Archive, as the national aggregator for archival metadata, is a good observatory of these practices with 21 million of descriptions, about 80,000 finding aids or collections from 135 content providers. As you can see on the workflow of data, it accepts all types of formats at the entry to be compatible with the offers of archival information systems available on the market. Some of these are based on RDBM, while others are more EAD 2002 friendly, and they have a more or less efficient vocabulary management tool. But in addition to difficulties linked to the tools, there are other human and financial difficulties, as indexing is considered a time-consuming task. Plus, with the mirage of full-text search at the beginning of computerization, many archivists have abandoned indexing in the 2000s, but are coming back slowly to it with the development of websites. However, we conducted some research like NAFAN, and you can see on the slide that about only 43% of the descriptions have some indexes. But contrary to the American practices, you have about 54% of collections indexed at fonts or collection level, and 45% at the lower levels. Indexing are mainly persons, corporate bodies, which we call agents, and place names, which corresponds to the main needs of end users. On France Archive, we extract these indexes from the description and try to align them with vocabularies on the web through semi-automated or manual script, which gives us mixed results, as you can see. The main difficulties for these alignments are the lack of precision in indexes. For example, we have very few dates for agents or identification with county or country for locations. The extensive use of pre-indexing or local vocabularies for subjects. And also, we've noted the inadequacy of vocabularies which are used, which are maintained mainly for libraries' use. It's not a criticism, it's just a constatation, because librarians have more in advance than archivists in this field. So for example, for agents, in the next 4 years, we are planning to develop on France Archive a repository for French agents mentioned in archives, which we hope may amount to 1 million of records. For geonames, for example, which used for place names, we've noted that it lacks local references to index under the town's level, and it lacks especially geohistorical dimensions for places.
In 2020, the CIF created a working group with representatives from national and local archival institutions. By putting indexing back at the core of archival practices, it aims to facilitate the user's search of information. The group is focused on the indexing practices from the decentralized web perspectives, collaboration between services, reuse of existing repositories, content aggregations for users. It deals with subject indexing, themes, agents, individual families and corporate body, and locations. In 2021, the working group published a third version of its guides, designed as a business and operational toolkit for archival institutions, aiming at harmonizing French practices. The tutorial is divided into 3 chapters: how to develop an indexing policy, implementing its computerized versions, examples. By now, the working group leads 3 projects: update of the guide based on state-of-the-art and feedback, studying web-exposed vocabularies, and updating the French thesaurus. The group explored different tracks according to the vocabulary. For subject themes vocabulary, French archivists wish to update the dedicated repository, support by a light and responsive governance. For agents, the orientation is twofold: align to worldwide vocabularies, contribute to future French national vocabulary by building a specialized archive repository from aggregating agents on French archive. For place, we will reuse existing offers such as geonames and national geographic reference systems. It will probably be necessary to combine solutions because none fixed perfectly. Each existing offers has an important limitation: geohistorical dimensions, updating, durability, scope, standardization, etc. Now we will present the use case. The launch of the Archives of Lands in indexing process is derived from its service strategy. The latter is designed to be user-centered, that is to say, ease document retrieval and accessed by users. To achieve it, indexing was quickly identified as a major entry point to archival resources. The indexing effort is closely correlated to a better mastery of the website contents and to the evolutions of mediations within the reading group. It is therefore at the heart of an eminently cross-disciplinary project, which involves the entire teams regardless of the sector of activity and position. Among the lessons learned by the Archives of Land from the current process is the observation that it is necessary a long process. Indexing is not an immediate goal, especially when starting from the scratch, pre-indexing for many years, heterogeneous practices between the members of the team. It required to go through a number of steps described on the slide, based mainly on training the team, formalizing a custom indexing policy, both scientific and technical. This document is a great help for each member of the staff, a guide for daily indexing practice. Through all these steps, it is essential to associate and accompany the team member who can feel a real part of the process. Each archival institution can aim at a particular and varied objectives through the implementation of an harmonized indexing. Within the Archives of the Land, we have chosen to put forward 2 objectives: to promote locally the knowledge of the land funds, thanks to an indexing of proximity, and to offer land resources the widest possible visibility at the national level and beyond, thanks to quality indexing. The scientific and technical choice outlined in the indexing policy reflect the pursuit of this compromise between, on one hand, an approach oriented as much as possible towards the user and the facilitation of its search, and on other hand, an adaptation as far as our technical means allow towards the complex technology of the web and its automated mechanism. The two cross objectives determine the practice of indexing and use of vocabulary. A compromise is sought.
At the National Archives, indexing of contemporary archives has been done systematically in Priam 3, but not always for the other fonts, which were indexed mainly in traditional paper finding aids. The computerization of these finding aids did not recover indexes, which were generally transferred into plain text. The release of the new archival information system in 2013 reflected a new organization without fixing the past heterogeneity of indexing practices. 10 years later, today, the lack is still present in current database. There are several reasons for this. Weakness of the software functionality, which doesn't offer an overview of indexing in the stock or doesn't allow mass modification. The 17 indexing vocabularies are difficult to handle and often inadequate. Thus, as indexing remains heterogeneous inside the institution, especially due to the lack of global recommendations about harmonized practices. But these vocabularies are enriched, aligned, and converted also in RDF for research projects, thus testifying to the expertise of the National Archives in this field. However, working along with the network of Archives départementales, the National Archives are today also committed to a real change management process because, as said for the long, all these actions can only succeed if people on whom they rely are fully involved. All fields of expertise are invited to participate in the reflections in a climate of trust and consensus. Main obstacles identified in this respect are working alone, seeking perfection, and forgetting the real target users, which is our public who consult the archives. In this respect, the current project of the National Archives rediscovers the methods initiated by Priam 3, and the loop is closed. In conclusion, from everything said above, there's just a few observations. After decades of no indexing or free indexing or indexing at institutions scale, the French archivists have come to the realization that indexing according to shared practices and vocabularies is the best way to offer a quality service to the public and to adapt to the expectations on the web or in reading rooms. The situation is favorable today to overcome the technical and human barriers involving the whole network of French archivists with the activities of the work group on descriptions and France Archive at the core. And any reuse of the data on Archives Portal Europe, Europeana, or any other aggregator, as well as in the Sparkle endpoint, are good incentives to continue our collective efforts to enhance our metadata at the source. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much to Manonmani and Louis for this presentation. And I think in terms of time, we go directly to the presentation from Javier and Santiago. So Santiago, if you want to share the screen, please go ahead.
I will present first part.
Yes.
Sorry. Yes, I think it's okay. Perfect.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Kerstin. Thank you very much for offering to us the opportunity to present and show as a case in Spain about how we use control vocabularies in the Spanish state archives, and particularly through the web portal Pares. First of all, and before starting any explanation, it's necessary to know that the current situation in Spain about general description in archives. In Spain, we have a package of 3 national standards for archival description that are commonly known as NEDA standards, which were approved since 2012 until 2018. These NEDA standards are based on the basic idea that the archival description is formed by the combination of different entities related to each other in multiple ways, generating descriptions and recreating the context of the records. The entities defined in NEDA standards are understood as elements that can be described by themselves. At the first level of our standards, we have 3 basic archival entities, which the most important is the records entity or documents entity. And it includes any records, any part of a record, or any set of records, reaching up to 8 different subtypes of record sets. Next, there is the archival entity known as agents, which includes any corporate body, any person, or any family that may be involved in records. And the third entity of NEDA standards is called functions, and contemplates every business activity, process, or action that are performed by agents and are evidenced in records. These 3 archival entities are defined in the NEDA standards as the high-level elements to develop an adequate records management, and the Spanish standards even offer a list of attributes with properties to describe them properly. But also the NEDA standards offer a second level of archival entities that are also important for providing context to the records that we keep in our archives and we describe in our systems. One of the second level entities is called mandate, understood as any kind of provision or rule that can regulate the other entities in the standards. The next entity that is also considered useful for make a broader context is the places, defined as any type of physical space. And the last entity that is contemplated in the NEDA standards received the composite name of concept, object, and events. And basically, it includes everything that is not included in the other entities. For these 3 entities, the NEDA standards do not offer any list of attributes like the first one, but they offer the possibility of developing their own descriptions or using control vocabularies if you want to manage them. To better understand these second level entities and how they can be thesaurized or use control vocabulary, NEDA standards detail which elements can be contemplated in each of them. For example, in the case of mandate entity, it is assimilated with any type of regulation, current, historical, written, not written, any type of official legislation, laws, decrees, any type of technical standards, and so on. In the case of places, NEDA standards ultimately include in this entity any point of coordinates or any polygon made by coordinates that can be located in a map. This contemplates any historical or current sites, any type of territory or jurisdictional areas, geographical features, engineering works anchored to the ground, roads, commercial routes, pilgrimage routes, etc. Even it would be possible to assimilate this entity with any point in outer space if it can be related with one of the other archival entities in NEDA standards. And finally, to finish my part of the intervention and give time to Santiago, the last entity called concept, objects, or events shifts to include any type of abstract notion any type of categorizations that can group things or other entities, any mythical or legendary entities, all of them understood as concepts. For the objects part of this entity, it would include every individual object that exists in real life, except records and persons, because in fact, they are other entities in NERA standards. And it also includes other possible legendary or fictional objects or materials. And in the case of event, this entity contemplates any period of time understood as a simple date or as a date range in the past, in the present, or in the future. And now I finished my part and I gave way to Santiago to explain how these theoretical elements in the standards from Spain are implemented in web portal Pares. I will leave to share and I will pass to Santiago.
Thanks, Javier. I'm going to share my presentation. 1 minute, please. Okay. First, I want to explain what is a Spanish archival portal called as Pares. The Spanish Archives portal is the main platform for the dissemination of Spanish historical documentary heritage, created and managed by the Subdirectorate General of the State Archives of the Ministry of Culture and Sport. It contains the classified records and digitized images of the documentary collections kept in the State Archives. Here some quantitative data about the description that we have in Pares, about records, digital objects, and description of no documentary entities. These no documentary entities is that we use as control vocabularies in Pares. This is our website. Okay. If you want to enter in other location, and these are the archives that, by the moment, have information in this portal in Pares. Only the archives, the state archives, the national archives, have information by the moment in the Spanish portal archive, not other archives like regional archives or other administration. Okay. The general rules for using control vocabularies in the Spanish portal archives are very general, because we have working in this type of descriptions since 2010, but we are improve our databases in technical questions and the description of these entities at the same time, and this is difficult, and we have to work slowly because our technical and human possibilities are slow and short. But in the first question that we have to have that we have to work is link different entities depending on the level description of the records that we are working. For example, for the funds or fund divisions, we link the entities, the description entities of the agents involved in the production, creation, custody, management, and accumulation of documents. These will be the mainly entities that we link to this level description of records. For the level of the collections, we mainly link the information, the entities of the collecting agents. The persons, corporate body, and families that collecting these documents. And for the level of series, the mainly entities that we link to this description will be the functions and activities that represented the functions that create these documents. And for the level of documentary units, the entities that we will be linked will be all the entities directly related in this document that appear in this document: agents, places, concepts, events, rules, etc. Other general rules that we use in our work are that the only entities mentioned in the document description shall be linked. And if we don't mention, for example, a person in the description, we don't link this entity of person, for example. Another rules is each entity may only be represented by one authority's font or preferred term, regardless of its relationship to the documentation. And for example, if an entity of person is the same, an entity of person will be the same if it's be linked to a document as a creator or as a subject. Then we will see an examples. Other rules that we use in our work. We make a description for each entity and we make relations between them and the document's entities. For the entities of agents, we use a description based on ISAL CPF with elements of EIC CPF. For the description of functions, we base our description on rule EASDF, and for place, concept, mandates, events, etc., we base our description in the ISO standards and the Saudi. And for making our relations, the relations are specific according to the type established by various standards. EIC-CPF, our national standards of archival description, the NEDA, etc. And the relationships are represented in the portal as hyperlinks between the unit description, the records of each entity. Now we are going to see some examples. By the moment, during the last date, we are having some technical problems in Paris, in the portal, and it's work slowly. I'm trying to simulate a navigation in the portal, okay? If we search in Paris the description of one entity, like Battle of Lepanto, is an entity of kind of event, and this is our description of this event in Paris. The Battle of Lepanto, in Spanish, Batalla de Lepanto, is our preferred term, but we try to translate this preferred term in other languages. For example, Battle of Lepanto in English, or Lepanto Kogudua in Basque language. So if a user search in our portal in different languages, they always going to this description. And we use also non-preferred term. For example, in Spanish, Batalla de Lepanto, and with the data. This description of event have a different relation. We are trying to build a thesaurus of these concepts, events, etc. And for Batalla de Lepanto, the generic terms will be in Spanish, batallas navales, in English, navy battles. Sorry for my English. And we relate this event also with different entities. For example, with the entities of person that participate in this battle. And one of these persons was Miguel de Cervantes. If we search in Paris or we click in this Miguel de Cervantes, we are going to this description. It's a description of person, of ethnicity of person. Miguel de Cervantes Saavedra with his information about his birth, his death, biography, history, and also with relations with other entities that we can navigate in the portal. Miguel de Cervantes was an author and writer, and we can click in this link in Spanish, escritores, and we will go to the description of this concept, the concept writers or escritores in Spanish. This is a description of a concept that we relate with other entities, with his generic terms, his specific terms, etc. And also we relate this description with other databases. For example, with the National Library of Spain. Okay. With the National Library of France, for example. Or the Library of Congress of the United States. Okay. If we go to Cervantes, to Miguel de Cervantes Saavedra, also we can see that he is related with other entities. For example, with a place. Alcalá de Henares is his birthplace. And we can click in this link and see the information, the description of this entity of place in Paris. Alcalá de Henares, our preferred term, but also we can see our not preferred terms. The older names of this city, Alcalá de Santiuste, Alcalá la Nueva. And the user can, if he search Alcalá de Henares or search Alcalá de Santiuste, we will go to this description in other cases. We have also information about the latitude and longitude, and we can view them in the map. Okay, this is Alcalá de Henares in Google Maps. And the relation of this place with other entities described in Paris. For example, with other places, specific terms, Cathedral of Alcalá de Henares, because the cathedral is in Alcalá de Henares, and other political geography, because we try to build a hierarchy of political geography in Paris. For example, Alcalá de Henares is part of the region of Madrid, and the region of Madrid is part of Spain, and Spain is part of Europe. In all this description of different entities in Paris, we can see in which documents are related to this entity. For example, information about Alcalá de Henares are in different records of different archives in our system. We have 5 documents that mention the city of Alcalá de Henares in the archive of Crown of Aragon, Archivo de la Corona de Aragón. So if we go to Miguel de Cervantes again, we can see that is related also with the other persons, other people. And we can specify this relation like family relationship. For example, Rodrigo de Cervantes is his son. And we can build with this information different visualization of this data. For example, we are working in generate genealogical trees with this in relationship. If we click here, we can see a view short genealogical tree for the family of Miguel de Cervantes. Okay. This is one of the possibilities that this kind of work with the entities description, with a complete entities description, can offer to our portal, to our system of databases. We can see this information in different forms, in different ways, and not only the description in our portal, but we can see also this kind of genealogical trees, maps, etc. And Miguel de Cervantes also is related with his book, Don Quixote de la Mancha, as an author of this book. If we click here, we can see the description of this concept that is Don Quixote de la Mancha, the book. Sorry for the slowly of Pares, but okay. If we continue in the description of Miguel de Cervantes, we can see that Miguel de Cervantes is related with different records of documents. For example, with 18 documents that are kept in the National Archive, National Historical Archive, Archivo Histórico Nacional. And one of them is this record, this document of in which Miguel de Cervantes sorry, I can recall the word in English. Is the privilege of the printing privilege of the El Quijote, of the book of the Quixote. We can see the description, the record, and we can see that Miguel de Cervantes appeared like access point of this description of document. Okay, is Miguel de Cervantes Saavedra, and also Don Quixote de la Mancha, other people, other person, and other concepts. And for this document, we have other information like the name of the creator of the corporate body that produced this document. In this case, is the Consejo de Castilla, and we can click in this link and see the description, the information about this kind of entity of corporate body, the Consejo de Castilla. with this history, his data, context, and description, and also relation with other people, associative relations, and with other corporate body, like these hierarchical relationships, and etc. And also the relation with the documents in different kind of relations. Is the Consejo de Castilla, this corporate body, is producer of these documents, has another context relation in these documents, and is subject or is mentioned in these documents.
Santiago, I'm
Yes,
really sorry, but I think we'll have to wrap up. I think that was
yes.
a great kind of illustration of how you can use entities and vocabularies to browse and navigate archival descriptions. We had one question in the chat, which I actually will directly let you answer, Santiago, because it was about Paris and on which platform it is based. If it's cloud-based or modular, maybe you can just kind of give a quick answer to this one.
What is the question? Sorry.
In which platform Paris is based?